Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to moderate the last panel of the day here. My name is Darren, and I just wanted to start off by thanking Bijan and Eunice from IPD, and Russell here on the stage as well for putting on this timely and thought-provoking event here. So earlier today, we had panels focused on security and trade, and now we're turning our attentions to diplomacy. For many years, Canada, like the United States and many other countries, have approached Taiwan under the One China policy. Under this policy, we have diplomatic relations with the PRC alone and conduct only limited informal diplomacy with Taipei. Now, the policy still persists, as we've heard from many of our speakers earlier on. However, closer relations with the PRCs are fading, and we're seeing Taiwan's way of life change and be threatened, and increasingly assertive and aggressive China. Today, Ottawa and many other like-minded countries are increasingly aware of this and have started to adjust their approach on security, on the economy, and on the diplomatic front with Taipei. Now, adjustments are warranted where Beijing is at and where the world is at today. We've heard that we can do a lot more with security and the economy, but there's an array of things that we can do diplomatically, bilaterally, multilaterally, which we'll explore with our panelists here today. So in the end here, we have Ambassador Currie, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues and Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations. We have Russell Hsiao, Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. Vina Nadjibulla, Adjunct Professor for the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at my alma mater, the University of British Columbia, and Fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And André, Laliberté, Professor, School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. So with this group here, I'm going to start by kicking off a question. How can diplomacy play a role in facilitating peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait? They'll speak for 5 minutes, and then following that, they'll have an opportunity to respond.
I'm glad you decided to conclude with the issue of diplomacy because we talked this morning about, and this afternoon, about how to flesh out our thinking about our relations with Taiwan. I use the word relation consciously, even though if it's not official, it's still substantially there are relations that we have developed over years with Taiwan. And I want to start by saying that, since we're talking about diplomacy, words matter. And because Taiwan is a society with a Chinese heritage, this is especially true. You know that there's something known as the rectification of names. So when the reality does not confirm with the way things are named, then the world is in trouble. And I want to address this issue of the rectification of name by thinking of a few expressions that have entered our lingo when we think of how Canada relates to Taiwan and China. I'll start with something very basic and very simple. We talk, for example, about the One China policy. There's something very specific. There's a few important elements in that policy. And I want to underline one, which is very important, and that really we ought to really let set in. The One China policy is premised on a very important condition, which is that the status quo shall not be changed by any of the two actors. There should not be a unilateral decision that upset the status quo. Well, I think that everyone here in the room knows that in recent years, that status quo has been threatened. And that status quo has been threatened, and I think it's important to remind us, unilaterally. If we look at the attitude of the Taiwanese government in terms of the respect for the status quo, the position of the Taiwanese authorities have not changed since the very beginning when that principle was presented. Since the beginning of the recognition, the diplomatic recognition of Canada of the PRC by Canada. So despite the change of government, and especially with the President Tsai Ing-wen, it's pretty clear that she has been adamant on avoiding changing the status quo. So not making any declaration about the independence of Taiwan and not upsetting really the nature of the relationship between the two countries. Since the first election of President Tsai, she had presented an olive branch to the Chinese authorities, hoping that there would be a dialogue between the two parties. That dialogue was turned down, and even in the last discourse that she pronounced last week, she reiterated again the fact that Taiwanese want to uphold the status quo. And our understanding from her likely successor within the DPP and perhaps the presidency, Lai Ching-te, is that he would hold that policy. And as we have discussed this morning, the competitor to Lai Ching-te also going to uphold that line. So in other words, the status quo from the perspective of Taiwan has not changed an iota. However, since Xi Jinping has consolidated his power, he has reiterated on many occasions that China must achieve the goal of reunification. And clearly, Xi Jinping has announced his willingness to really put into question that status quo. I think we have to be very clear that in our relationship with China, that China is not respecting its engagement. And the terms of our recognitions of the People's Republic of China are being questioned the moment that China is upsetting that through either a direct intervention or even an indirect intervention, whether a blockade or forms of low-intensity aggression against Taiwan. So I think I've said enough for the moment, but I'll be happy to continue in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Turn it over to Vina.
Thank you very much, Darren. Thank you very much to IPD for organizing this and for all of you for staying to the last panel. So otherwise we'd be speaking to half-empty room. I'll just follow up on what André was mentioning, that when we talk about diplomacy, obviously we are looking at the efforts of Taiwan and under the leadership of President Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP, who have been very keen to engage in dialogue with China, but it takes two to tango, and in this case, PRC has not been willing and has used the precondition of the 1992 consensus. But I think it's also important to recognize what PRC is actually trying to do. I think there was earlier in one of the panels a recognition that PRC has shifted from a policy of deterring independence to a policy of compelling unification. And within that, it's important to note that although their official statements, either the 2019 speech that President Xi delivered on the topic of Taiwan, his only comprehensive speech on Taiwan since he came to power, or the third white paper that PRC issued on Taiwan in 2022, while those papers still state that peaceful development and volunteer unification is the first choice and use of force is the last resort, the policy that they're currently implementing is one of coercion and intimidation. And the primary goal of that policy of coercion and intimidation is to break the psychological will of the people of Taiwan, to essentially convince them that they are isolated internationally, that their partners, United States, Japan, and others, are unreliable, that they're divided internally and facing all sorts of economic challenges, and that they're completely dependent on PRC for their prosperity and their peaceful future. That is the narrative, that is the kind of the psychological breakdown of the will, the imposition of its own will that China, PRC is engaged in through multiple strategies of both cyber attacks, gray zone tactics, disinformation, and so forth. So in our engagement, we have to be very careful that we don't inadvertently amplify some of these messages and essentially do the CCP's work for them. So while we need to be, and this, I agree with André that words matter, messaging, narratives matter. While we need to be crystal clear about the challenge and the threat that PRC represents to the region and to the world, we have to be careful not to hype up the threat or the imminence of a conflict such that it has negative implications for Taiwan in the way that Director Sang mentioned, right? So we have to be careful, clear-eyed, but not sort of fall into the invasion is imminent narrative that sometimes we see in the Western media. Because that is exactly what PRC wants us to believe, that they are prepared to endure whatever cost necessary to achieve this goal. And we have to make sure that we build the resilience, the deterrence, and the diplomacy that's needed without actually then succumbing to that messaging from them. The other pitfall that we have to avoid is instrumentalizing Taiwan. It's really easy in the context of the geopolitical competition and the kind of the strategic importance that Taiwan really represents. And absolutely, there's no doubt about that, both from a first island chain and also from the perspective of semiconductor chips and just the significance of Taiwan. It's easy to instrumentalize it and to see it as a pawn in this greater game. But we have to constantly remember the agency of the 24 million people who live on the island, the fact that it is a robust liberal democracy, and we have to engage with Taiwan as a partner in its own right, recognizing its strategic and also alliance in terms of values and norms, and the fact that it is a fellow democracy that requires our support and partnership. So those two pitfalls have to be avoided. I've spoken about a little bit the kind of the difficulty of engaging in dialogue and diplomacy for the DPP government with the PRC. I hope as the panel unfolds, we'll speak a little bit about the elections and sort of the upcoming elections in Taiwan and what it means, sort of the kind of the three main parties or potentially two parties if there is unity between DPP and KMT before the November 24th deadline for the presidential nominations, what that would mean for the diplomatic efforts and whether or not PRC will continue to reject essentially diplomacy and dialogue with the elected leadership, if it is again Vice President Lai Ching-te, who gets the presidency potentially in the beginning of 2024, what that would mean for Taiwan moving forward. One other thing that I'll mention before, I guess, coming back to other questions is the, again, importance of diplomacy from a perspective of internationalizing the issue of Taiwan. And this is where Canada can play a role because PRC would like to deal with the issue very much bilaterally with Taiwan, again, as part of that tactic of imposing its will on Taiwan and not allowing others to play a part in that. So internationalizing the issue, meaning having statements of the G7, which recently have begun to do that, where there's a strong language about the importance of preserving peace and stability in the region, opposing any kind of unilateral change. Having those statements also in NATO, so more and more forums having a conversation about the significance of this issue and the fact that any kind of unilateral change to the status quo will be opposed. And that's obviously public messaging, but we also need private messaging that are delivered directly to President Xi, particularly from the European countries. So this is where I think EU plays a critical role. They have to start speaking specifically about the economic consequences, sanctions, and other things that will happen if PRC were to take this action. And I think this is where EU, Japan, Australia, Canada, and others singing from the same song sheet would really make a difference in private conversations with the PRC authorities. I will stop there. I think there's a lot of other issues we can touch on, but yeah.
Russell, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Darren. And thanks again, Bijan, for assigning me a second role in today's discussion. I suspect that you, extra credit, I suspect that that was purposely done to prevent me from going outside and enjoying this beautiful Ottawa weather. But thank you nonetheless, and again, it's a pleasure to be on stage with such esteemed co-panelists and to discuss the issue of diplomacy in Taiwan. I think my approach to addressing this issue will talk more specifically actually on a point that Vina had just raised, and that is why the internationalization of Taiwan is vital for maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And there's really two primary reasons that I can think of that necessitates the further internationalization of Taiwan. And that is one for resiliency, and the second is for deterrence. I think some backdrop to my discussion is necessary, just to give some context to why we're seeing this internationalization of Taiwan now. And I think it's instructive to go back more recently to around 6 years ago, where over the past 6 years, Taiwan has now lost 9 diplomatic partners, where it currently maintains only 13 diplomatic partners. And this is the result of a systematic diplomatic offensive pressure campaign waged by the People's Republic of China to isolate Taiwan internationally and marginalize its people from being able to participate in the international community. This is aimed at delegitimizing Taiwan in the international community and thereby sapping the morale of the population to, as Vina, I think, earlier referenced to, sapping its sort of psychological will to resist, to create the conditions in which the people may feel that resistance is futile and that the absorption of Taiwan under the People's Republic of China is inevitable. And as such, I think it's important that international support or internationalization of Taiwan be a part of the overall, diplomatic, political efforts to be able to push back against CCP political warfare, which really undermines some of the basic tenets of respective policies of various countries, to include the United States, as well as, I think, as André referenced to earlier, Canada, with respect to our own one China policies, since the PRC has utilized and distorted various interpretations of even UN resolutions, for that matter. For instance, UN Resolution 2758 in 1971 that disposed narrowly of the question of which entity held the seat of China in the United Nations Security Council, but has since been utilized and applied erroneously by the PRC to preclude Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations. And I think, and this is, this has led to this marginalization of Taiwan and isolation of Taiwan that creates, I think, if in the long run this is allowed to continue onwards, a very dangerous situation where Taiwan could find itself in a situation where it has 0 diplomatic partners. Now, one could argue, and I know that there are very thoughtful people who would argue that, yes, of course, Taiwan's most important partners are in fact not their diplomatic partners. But nevertheless, I think in the eyes of the international community and for purposes of recognition of its statehood, of which I would say that recognition is not a prerequisite for the definition of the state under the Montevideo Convention, but nevertheless there is a sort of legitimacy that comes from being able to be recognized. There are some practical hurdles, in fact, also of that where the lack of diplomatic ties do prevent, in some circumstances, the ability to interact to shore up some very practical means of being able to support both Taiwan's own means to self-defense and more so to the earlier point about the resiliency of the population. I think had we not seen the outpour of international support that we've seen for Taiwan over the last 6-7 years, the situation in Taiwan would be very different, right? And that situation would be because we will have a civilian population that would be increasingly pressurized that could open up channels for considerations of Taiwan's own future status. And it is, of course, a very clear change in the status quo should, again, this pressure campaign and isolation campaign continue. This isn't happening only in the diplomatic space, of course, right? This is happening in the international organizations where, as referenced earlier, Taiwan has been prevented from, by Beijing, being able to even observe in many of the international organizations that it had previously been permitted to do so by the graces of Beijing. But of course, any policy that is premised on the graces of Beijing is one that is unsustainable. And so that was really never a sustainable approach to a long-term solution. And as such, that cannot be relied on in order to ensure Taiwan's long-term, I think, resiliency against these pressure campaign. The second point I would add is to the deterrent aspect of the internationalization of Taiwan. And that is important because it signals to Beijing that in the event of a military conflict over Taiwan, it potentially could not only face the United States and Japan, but also the international community in areas that it could have an overall deterrent effect in not only the military side, but also the economic side. And I think there is that's why I think it's very important that the economic angle is not sort of lost in our overall discussions about deterrence, because we do have to think holistically about it, since that could be what tips the balance in the considerations in Beijing of whether to engage in a highly destructive and bloody conflict that is absolutely no one's interest. And I think we need to think about all the tools that are at our disposal, and bringing the international community and highlighting, of course, which I do see the international community doing through G7s and statements, through multilateral engagement, bilateral engagements between allies and partners, providing that signal to say that this is certainly not what Beijing wants to sort of project this as, which is an internal issue, for the People's Republic of China, but an international one, right? So I'm not saying anything necessarily groundbreaking or new, right? Because many senior leaders now have repeatedly called the Taiwan issue an international issue, right? And to include most recently, the South Korean, president. As I referenced earlier, some of the very transformative approaches taken by Seoul in its security perceptions with regards to Taiwan has been quite remarkable in recent months. And so I think that serves as an important cost consideration for Beijing when, again, the international community becomes much more involved and vocal about Taiwan. So let me stop there, and then I'll look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Russell. I'll turn it over to Ambassador Currie.
So, being the last panelist at a day-long conference, you're in that an enviable position where everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So I hope I can find something useful and interesting. And I love the fact that André brought up and started with the rectification of names and the need to call things by their right name as this foundational Confucian thought and framing around things, because diplomacy is in many ways the opposite of rectification of names. Diplomats spend a lot of time getting people to agree to words on paper, to a set of words on paper, getting parties in negotiations to agree to put some words down on paper, but not necessarily agree that those words mean the same thing to the different parties. And so I think that's a good way of thinking about diplomacy when it comes to Taiwan, because the U.S. and other countries, our relations with Taiwan and our policies about Taiwan are based on, in many ways, a bunch of useful fictions that we walk around with and use to elide over some pretty fundamental and serious differences in order to keep the whole situation from blowing up into open conflict every other day. And that's worked okay, more or less, with a few flare-ups over the years and crises across the Taiwan Straits. But as my co-panelists, in particular Vina, have pointed out, and André also, I think very effectively, the status quo has been altered. It has been altered by one side of the Straits, not the other, in a very assertive and aggressive way. And we are, those of us who believe that the people of Taiwan should be the arbiters of their own future, not people sitting in Zhongnanhai, are deeply concerned about this, but yet we haven't really caught up to what this means and come up with the right set of tools to maintain all of the useful fictions that we carry around in our heads, while also responding to the fact that the ground has shifted underneath our feet. So it's a very displaced place to be. All of that said, I guess I've got to try to come up with something useful and helpful and tactical that we can do about this. So I've kind of come up with some do's and don'ts that are helping, that when I was representing the United States at the United Nations, that kind of helped me to get through the day, and while carrying out a mandate that we had, which was to support Taiwan's presence in international spaces and to help expand that space for them at a time when Beijing was putting a lot of, and continues to put a lot of pressure on both individual countries as well as those international spaces as a whole. And I think that, as Russ helpfully mentioned, the way that the resolution on China's seat in the United Nations has taken on this expansive character to incorporate everything related to the UN and being used as a cudgel to block Taiwan's participation and the representation of 23 million people living on Taiwan in any way, shape, or form in any and all UN agencies is an incredibly vivid example of how China has taken a very small document, a very small resolution that had a very specific meaning behind it and was very, very, like, I think it has like 4 paragraphs in it, and used it to cover over the entire UN system in all of its glory. I'll use that word. And how we've got to start being smarter about how we think about that system ourselves if we truly care about preserving the norms and the normative frameworks that we have, that were instrumental in the creation of what people like to call the rules-based international order. And I say that with a little bit of an eye roll because, I think that one thing that at the end of the day, many of us might agree with Beijing on is that the rules-based international order is neither rules-based nor international or very orderly. And so that we, in some ways, again, one of these useful fictions that we walk around with in order to be diplomats, I think that may be one of them. And whether it's starting to outlive its usefulness as a construct is a topic for another panel, but it is something that I think informs this conversation we're having. So back to my do's and don'ts. I think that, first, to the point that Ross made, we've got to stop helping Beijing destroy the system that we built. Like, that's kind of a baseline thing, right? Is we've got to actually decide that we want to defend that system, and that includes the normative frameworks that underpin it. And there, I'm specifically talking about the human rights framework that is informed by a belief that human rights are intrinsic to the individual, that they belong to individuals by virtue of being born human, and they are not things that states or governments get to negotiate away, no matter how big or powerful they are. And that means that we, as whether it's the United States or Canada or and every country beyond that that actually espouses to believe in these rights and goes out and talks about them and joins things like the Human Rights Council to talk about them and talks about them in our statements as a government internally and externally, that we have to actually be serious about defending these things. And we have to get serious about defending that part of the global order. It can't just be about the WTO. It's got to be about these ideas that are about humanity. And we have to kind of go back and remember, and I think this is a particularly poignant moment to do that with the Middle East in flames after the terrorist attacks on Israel, that why we created this normative framework and where that project grew out of and why it exists and why Beijing is so threatened by it. So I think that part of that means in addition to our own need to be more full-throated in the way and more, I think, serious, or we need to stop talking about them at all. If we're not going to be serious about it, then we need to just stop pretending that it's a real thing, because it just creates opportunities for Beijing to leverage against us and accuse us of hypocrisy. And that resonates quite well outside of our own little bubbles. I can tell you that. But if we are serious, then we need to start raising the cost of the behaviors that we find to be norm breaking and that we find and we need to start raising the cost of the efforts to destroy these norms that are underway by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party and the party state. And so I think that means, I'll give you some very specific examples. If you look at how the concept of shared future of humanity for all mankind, which is the essence of Xi Jinping thought, and the comprehensive national security policies that she has rolled out at home and abroad through the domestic policy securitization of everything inside China, as well as the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative. He has laid out what he thinks the norms should be that should underpin the global rules-based order according to Xi Jinping. And they are antithetical to the norms that we all believe in, going back to that very baseline one about human rights attaching at the individual level. And so I think that if we've got to actually start talking about this and explaining and not just discussing in a very kind of egotistical or assuming that everybody understands what we mean when we say human rights belong to everyone, or that they attach at the individual level, and that these things are important, or that that human rights are not conditional. We've actually got to start being serious about that. And we've got to go to countries where this message has an appeal, especially in the developing world, and talk to them about what they want from the human rights regime, what they want from the global rules-based international rules-based order, and what it is that they find appealing about the version that China is putting out there in the world. And here is a great place where Taiwan can be helpful. And I agree we shouldn't instrumentalize Taiwan, but Taiwan is actually in many ways a much better model for small, poor, developing countries than China. You're not going to, if you're Botswana, you're never going to be China, but you could be Taiwan. And so I think that we've got to think more creatively and look as Taiwan, I love during the pandemic, the slogan that came out of President Tsai's office, Taiwan can help, and I took that to heart. Taiwan can help. We've got to think of them as less of a problem and more as Taiwan can help. Taiwan can be part of the answer to these problems that we're struggling with in the developed world and in the rich democracies. So I think that when we, instead of seeing Taiwan as this kind of pebble in our shoe, as the Indonesians used to say about East Timor, they did used to say that, but that we need to think of it as part of the solution. And so I think that that's a big thing. The other thing, and as Vina said, we've got to stop self-deterring. And that's, these are all connected to us. This tendency to self-deter and to assume that we shouldn't do something because it might provoke Beijing. I'm like, sorry, they're provoking themselves. They provoke themselves. So that doesn't mean that we should self-deter because they are self-provoking. I think that that's something that we've really got to get out of this mental habit of doing, and we got to do it soon. And I think one final point that I can make, if I would, is that, if we're thinking about asymmetries, and we've got to really think about the asymmetries between the way that they approach the world, the way that Beijing approaches the world, and I think it comes through very strongly with this idea that they're going to compel Taiwan toward reunification. Like, this idea is so antithetical to anything that we believe, but yet they talk about it openly, and there's been no consequence to that, or almost no consequence, except for us, our Canadian friends joining us on some FONOPs. It's very, what they're saying and the response have been completely asymmetrical, and what they're doing and the response have been very asymmetrical. We're never going to be able to do the things that they do because they come from a very different system, but not all of these asymmetries are bad, and we need to think about where we have comparative advantages and start to lean into those things instead of trying to fight them on their field, which we can't win a race to the bottom with Beijing. We have to think about how we force them to play according, the thing that they don't want to have to do is play according to the rules that they can't win by. And so that's what we've got to really start thinking diplomatically about that, instead of doing the things that we've been doing, walking around trying to defend these ideas in our head that really are not really defensible anymore. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I'll turn it over to Vina.
Yeah, just a quick, in the spirit of being interactive and responding to what other panelists have said, I just wanted to add something to what Kelley has been mentioning, that diplomacy around Taiwan has been deliberately very ambiguous and very layered, everything from strategic ambiguity to the different interpretations of the 1992 consensus on the One China and so forth, and that has helped in that there hasn't been an open conflict in the region, but that it might be under strain now. Be that as it may, I think what's important for us to consider is what is our North Star? China, PRC has been extremely clear about what it is seeking, right? Which is unification, annexation, absorption of Taiwan. And that is their goal, and they're willing to go about it through peaceful development if there is sort of what they consider more friendly government of Maingzhou and KMT from 2008 to 2016. If they feel like it's less friendly, they're much more bellicose. And so they may change their tactics, but the North Star is very clear. For us, we also have to be clear. Our diplomatic language may be very clever and creative and so forth, but we have to be clear what it is that we're trying to achieve. And in this case, it's peace and stability in the region, it's political independence and democracy for Taiwan, and it's preservation of diplomatic space for Taiwan to engage in the region and in the world, because it's important for us to have bilateral trade agreements and so forth with Taiwan, but it won't work unless Taiwan is also integrated into the regional economy and regional trade agreements and all the alliance structures that are being put in place. The previous panel obviously talked about CPTPP, which is really important, and I think that needs to be a key priority, and Canada should and must play a role, especially as it chairs in 2024, the CPTPP and the process. But because at the moment, if you really look, Taiwan is out of RCEP, it's out of IPEF. There are many other things that are happening that it's not participating in, so we have to really maintain some space, and we have to be quite clear why it's not in IPEF. It's because other ASEAN countries didn't want it to be there, right? So there's quite a bit of diplomacy that still needs to happen with other partners in the region to persuade them that Taiwan is an economic partner, that is a significant player that needs to be party to these agreements and needs to be further integrated. One other thing in terms of being clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve, we also have to be clear that it's not going to be cost-free, right, that there are going to be actual resources that are necessary to invest in this. And that's especially because we now have competing priorities in Ukraine and the Middle East, and for a country like Canada that already underinvests significantly in its defense and foreign policy, we cannot be a player in the Indo-Pacific if we are not actually putting resources behind that, right? And yes, the strategy has 2.3 million over 5 years, but that is peanuts if you compare to what we've already submitted to, have contributed to Ukraine, 9.5 billion, right? So we have 2-point-something million for an entire region over 5 years, that is not enough of a commitment. Our contribution on peace and security is $500,000. What are you going to do with that in that region? Very little. So, and in order to commit resources, we need our leadership to engage in a serious, mature conversation with Canadians about why this matters. Why stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific and the Taiwan Strait is of national importance and part of the national interest of Canada, right? Like why this matters to our economic prosperity, why this matters to rules-based international order and so forth. So we need to have a conversation, and it cannot just be because of people-to-people ties and diaspora. We have to move away from that simplistic understanding of just because we have people in the country, just because we're diverse and have a robust immigrant population, that somehow we understand why engagement matters, right? There has to be a much more robust national conversation. And I think our allies need to really hold our feet to the fire, because we are very good at being, well, until recently we were at many tables. We're increasingly left out from many tables, but I think in part because the world is catching up that we're not contributing to the bill when it comes to it. So, but our allies need to encourage us to actually play that role. And I think certainly US and others need to start demanding more of us, given the role that we can play, and given it's a G7 country and so forth. So that's another point in terms of like just diplomatic language may be unclear, but let's be clear, what are we trying to achieve?
And just at the risk of offending our host here in Ottawa, and again, I should express my gratitude for being invited, and I love Canada, all the necessary preamble, and knowing whatever, but one issue where, you know, Canada is recognized globally as a human rights leading proponent of human rights. You have just as the United States, Australia, other countries that have gone through internal colonial issues, we have a story to tell that is, you know, we do actually a good job of, in a way, you know, through working through all of this pain and talking about it in a way that I think actually can help us instead of being defensive about it. And Canada is actually really great about not being defensive about this, and much more so than the United States is, I will say. So that's one thing. But one issue where we do, I think, need to really look at greater outspokenness from Canada, and where we can all cooperate, is on this issue of transnational repression, because you have a population of Canadians of Chinese extraction who are being deeply harassed. I don't need to tell you this. We have the same problem in the United States. Other countries with Chinese minority communities have the same problem. This is not going to get better unless we do something about it. And this is what I mean about raising the cost of bad norms transgressing behavior by Beijing, especially when it happens on our territory. It's unconscionable that we have not moved already for, you know, resolutions on transnational repression in the UN, and done things like that, where we can really actually, you know, make a statement that this is unacceptable. We talk about it domestically, but we don't really go out and talk about it as a, you know, we haven't really organized ourselves. We also did a really poor job when it came to when the UN Human Rights Council was debating whether to debate about the report that the Office of the High Commissioner did on the situation in Xinjiang and the mass human rights abuses against the Uyghur people and other Muslims in China. And we failed to mobilize sufficient diplomatic resources and political will behind that resolution, and it failed. And that allowed China to take a huge victory. And we've done nothing in the past year since that happened. We've done nothing. And it's unconscionable. Like, we got to either get serious about these things or stop altogether, because the Chinese are very serious, and they put tremendous resources into the Human Rights Council and into quashing any possibility that they will be criticized for their human rights violations, because they know how important it is. We seem to just take it for granted that everybody knows how important it is, and that's not the case. And we've got to get serious, or we just got to stop talking about it.
Milan André, jump in here.
Okay. I'm so glad you raised the issue of human rights. I would like to raise one fundamental one, the right to self-determination. I just wish that our diplomatic corps in Canada and other like-minded country rehearse a set of principles. I'm really getting sick every time I read the newspaper and I read a quotation from Xi Jinping about the unfinished job of reunification. Okay, I'm speaking as a Canadian, married to an Australian. We're fully aware of the importance of our history, right? We are having in our countries psychodrama about the abuse of indigenous people. So why not do some history when we interact with Chinese? Saying that, well, the issue of the so-called unfinished conflict between China and Taiwan is wrong. I mean, conceptually, it's wrong. This was an issue of a civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China. That's the civil war. That's what the civil war was all about. Well, in 1991, President Lee Teng-hui said, this is over. The Kuomintang, which he led, I remind you, proclaimed that the civil war is over because the Kuomintang does not anymore have any claim about mainland China. Well, Jiang Zemin, of course, would not understand this. But my point is simply that our diplomatic corps should be used to just refuse to agree with the statements that are coming from representatives of China when they are talking about a situation of reunification that is unachieved. No, the Canadian position recognizes that Beijing rules mainland China and does not say anything about the situation of Taiwan. Now, our position again is that the situation of Taiwan must be resolved by the Taiwanese part. Well, the Taiwanese have already demonstrated very clearly since 1992 in their local elections that they have the capacity to govern themselves. And to go back to Russell's point before, Taiwan meets all the criteria of the Montevideo Convention as a sovereign state. So I think that we have to start thinking about using the dialogue of the right of self-determination. There are other entities in this planet that have achieved independence in recent years because of a slow, patient process of making their case. And I'm going to throw this. It's a provocative statement, but I think we ought to think about it. We have to start thinking about pushing for the recognition of Taiwan as a sovereign state. So there you go.
Yeah, Russell, go ahead. Definitely. Russell and Vina.
The comments made earlier, both by Kelley and Vina, about being clear about our strategic interest in Taiwan. And I think, while I think the defense and military side of the issue has been fairly well articulated and defined in terms of, the interest in Taiwan and preserving and protecting it from a military conquest by the People's Republic of China, so much so that now publicly senior defense officials in the United States refer to Taiwan as a critical node, right, in the first island chain. That has brought some pushbacks from some within the sort of the more pro-Chinese, sort of analytical communities that sees this as sort of a challenge to, the Beijing's position by professing a strategic interest in the geography, the clear geography of Taiwan. But there are other aspects of Taiwan that I think needs to be clearly articulated. It is not only a critical node in the first island chain, it is a critical node in the community of democracies. And I do credit the current Biden administration in the United States for its effort to bring Taiwan into the fold of the community of democracies with its Summit for Democracy, right? And so being able to, and for the longest period of time, it was, hard for me to understand, besides, of course, the practical reality of concerns about Beijing's reactions, why Taiwan had not been previously included in iterations of the community of democracies, despite the fact that it is. But I think now there's a slow realization that we have wrapped ourselves in these self-imposed restrictions for fear of provoking Beijing when Beijing doesn't care, right? And thirdly, and I think this is perhaps much more much more of a growing recognition in the international community, that is that Taiwan's a critical node in the global supply chain. right? And I think these three layers, I think, do serve as very important measures by which we can assess our respective strategic interests to Taiwan, irrespective, of definitions of sovereignty and recognition, right? And I would just conclude by referencing a point that you made, André, earlier in your opening comments, which is about the substance of ties. And I think, it became more increasingly clear to me in our work, at GTI, that, diplomatic relations are not the only measure, or even perhaps the best measure of the substance of ties. And that the United States has more substantive interest in relations with Taiwan than it does with many of its diplomatic partners. In fact, many of its diplomatic partners, right? And that, and as such, I think we need to think creatively about how we engage Taiwan. And just one last point, and I think just in the interest of putting sort of ideas onto the table here, which I know this is what Bijan has instructed all of us to do in our discussion, I would just want to credit the, and really sort of, promote here the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, which was established by the United States and Taiwan back in 2015, now counts Japan and Australia as formal coordinating partners that organizes countless international forums that includes foreign government officials as well as experts in all fields, civil society as well, in all fields where it can really demonstrate the Taiwan model that Kelley was referencing earlier, from areas of, issues of women empowerment to, global environmental issues to transnational crime and cybersecurity, right? I mean, this is just to name a few of the many areas in which these workshops, again, which count United States, Taiwan, Australia, and Japan as formal coordinating partners, are now going to, have been regularly providing alternative forums in which existing international institutions unreasonably prevent Taiwan's ability to participate.
And I'm so glad you bring up GCTF because it is literally the opposite of the Belt and Road model. It is almost, again, diametric opposite of how the Belt and Road has rolled out. It is all about, building capacity and helping countries strengthen their own societal resilience, and putting themselves on a road towards self-sufficiency and toward, real sovereignty and independence, instead of the dependency, debt-driven model of the Belt and Road. And so, again, it's just a perfect example of why we need to see Taiwan as part of the solution.
And before we turn to Vina here, I'm going to let a line quietly form for Q&A, but it's going to be
Yes.
Vina, André, then the line.
That's, I want to jump in to react to what André ended with in terms of de jure independence. And I think I will go back to my original point that on that, we should be guided by what President Tsai Ing-wen has said and what the people of Taiwan have said very clearly many times, that the president has said that the country is already independent, so we don't need to have de jure independence and that symbolic extra step. The population wants to maintain status quo, which is de facto independence, and not. And I think it's important for us on the outside to engage in meaningful efforts that support Taiwan, but to really refrain from symbolic actions that may have really high costs because they cross red lines, but don't actually meaningfully change what's already there. Taiwan is functioning as a self-governing, democratic polity, and we need to maintain that, and we need to invest all of our resources in all the things we've already mentioned: collective deterrence, diplomacy, building resilience and capacity in Taiwan. The symbolic gestures of renaming things and or de jure independence, I think, while may feel morally satisfactory, may not be the most prudent and smart way to proceed especially at this moment, right? I mean, we're essentially are playing for time. We need we need to buy ourselves time to be able to put in place the kind of alliance structure that we have in the region through the Quad, AUKUS, and other things. We need to prevent an immediate crisis now, and all efforts that maintain stability now to allow Taiwan to continue as a democratic, prosperous society has to be supported. And I think quick efforts to kind of feel good around de jure acknowledgements may not be as prudent. So I'll just offer that as a counter to that.
I just want to say that I don't disagree with you. And we cannot go, where the Taiwanese themselves don't want to go. That's totally sensible. No, what I'm saying, though, is that we have observed, we agree again on that, we have observed a drift where we let the Chinese side determine what is acceptable. And so I said we have to push back against that. We have to say the status quo is, the discourse of Xi Jinping, and I have, again, to emphasize, I never talk about China. I always talked about the Communist Party, and unfortunately, since 2012, we have to talk about Xi Jinping. That's three different things. It's very important to be clear on that as well. I think we cannot, of course, go ahead of the Taiwanese themselves. But we have also to be prepared for contingency, and that's the other comment I will leave open again as a matter of, thinking ahead. What is going to be our position? And are people already thinking or having scenario about a possible intervention? I'm afraid I'm the pessimist in the room. I'm really not convinced that Xi Jinping will show restraint. I'm really concerned that he's not in a capacity to listen to his generals if his generals would not dare tell him that an operation against Taiwan might fail. I'm just not convinced of that. So I have no reason to believe that if Xi Jinping wants to intervene in Taiwan, I don't see where the dissuasion the deterrence is coming from now. So I apologize for my pessimism. And
let's turn it over to first one is Margaret.
Thank you. Margaret McQuaig-Johnston from the University of Ottawa. I would like to thank all five of you. This has been a really remarkable panel. You all have spoken so clearly messages that we all really need to hear, and I think particularly, Vina, the reminder that we can't talk constantly about the inevitability and feed into a fait accompli and self-fulfilling prophecy. And I've fallen into this myself from time to time because I do fear a takeover. But I will be much more careful, so thank you very much. I think we'd like to keep you together as a panel for the rest of the week to visit government officials' offices and politicians' offices so they can hear so clearly the message you delivered. Just a diplomatic question, I guess. All of us in this room, we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe in the importance of Taiwan and it finding its place. Diplomatically, how do we address the other countries in that region who are concerned about alienating China? And economically, they can't afford to do that. But they may feel that, you're right, Taiwan has merit in so many ways, but we have to be careful not to, we know which side our bread is buttered on. How do you deal with that?
Sure, we'll do a couple of... Yes.
My name is Harry Chen. I'm representative of Taipei Economic and Cultural Office. I think when it comes to the role of diplomacy when dealing with Taiwan, there's one thing that almost immediately pop up to the minds of everyone, which is one China policy, because that's a policy adopted by most countries in the world. But I want to point out that there is a big difference between one China policy and one China principle. Because one China principle is given a fixed definition by the PRC, which is divided into three parts, right? There is only one China in the world. The PRC is the sole legal government of that China, and Taiwan is part of China. And when that is defined this way, it's a straitjacket. Any government has not turn around, no room to turn around. But try to find the legal document, the official document that your country signed with the PRC when you set up diplomatic relations. It is not one China principle that you use. It is one China policy. But one China policy has no fixed definition. It is defined by you. So there is a huge room for you to maneuver, if you like. And I want to let you know that Taiwan has no policy for seeking independence. But we do hope that when countries implement their one China policy, you can try to be as innovative, as imaginative as possible, because that wouldn't be out of the realm of your foreign policy. And I think my question is very simple. That is the way we look at it from Taiwan. Maybe also for some people who know the difference between these two terms. But does it help in reality for your country or for Taiwan to be able to push our foreign policy to a better extent just by pointing out the difference between the two terms?
Let's respond to those two, and then we'll take the next two. Sure. Down the road.
Sure. I think that, yeah, I think that the answer to the second question sort of gets at the answer to Margaret's question in a way, because if we are clear that, look, we have a one China policy, this is what our one China policy is when we're communicating with countries in the region, with Thailand, Indonesia, our partners in the region, that we want that we do explain what we mean, and that is not the same thing as the one China principle that the PRC espouses. That is part one of engaging those countries and their concerns about and their sensitivities around Taiwan. I think that the other part of it is that most of these countries already do an enormous amount of trade with Taiwan. They are already very well integrated economically with Taiwan and get a lot of Taiwanese investment. Part of this is also a little bit of talking to Taiwan about the quality of their investment and their relations with these countries as well, and making sure that, that Taiwanese investors into Southeast Asian countries are holding themselves to higher standards, and in the way that they treat workers, in the way that they maintain their facilities and the rights that they recognize, that they hold themselves to that high standard and distinguish themselves from investment that's coming from the mainland. And then also in the way that Taiwan treats guest workers who come into Taiwan from a lot of these countries, and make sure that they are respecting and honoring the rights and treating them well as guest workers, because that is another area of friction. So working with Taiwan as a partner to help smooth some of these areas of friction and not create excuses for non-cooperation is kind of like is another, like, I think, preventative thing we can do. But it's really, at the end of the day, just going to take putting the diplomatic resources and effort into doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of addressing the sensitivities of some countries with regards to, engagement with Taiwan or support for Taiwan, I think we can just be explicitly clear. The alternative of a military invasion of Taiwan would be far more costly than, supporting to deter that military invasion, right? Because if their military invasion occurred, it wouldn't just be Taiwan, it would also be China, but it would be the entire world also as well. President Biden has stated this pretty clearly when the response that he had made in Japan, next to Prime Minister Kishida, where he just outlined that this dislocation that would result as a result of a war over Taiwan would be enormous. Right? I mean, I don't think enormous was the exact word that he used, but the idea should be absolutely clear that it is in no one's interest, even for countries with sensitivities in terms of engagements with Taiwan, that this should happen. And I would also add that, while I'm aware that there are such sensitivities among some countries of the engagement with Taiwan, I think we ignore the positive demonstration effects that engagement with Taiwan provides, not only for the resiliency and deterrence angle, but it provides an example for other countries to similarly engage in their own interaction with Taiwan based on their own, one China policies, right? And I think, the cases of Lithuania stands out. The Czech Republic also stands out. Japan, and other countries are understanding that because of, I think, the leadership that the United States and other free world countries has taken in standing up for its own policies with regards to Taiwan, to lead by example and setting those examples for other countries as well.
But we do have to actually stand up for those policies. And sometimes we are seen dithering and, again, self-deterring on Taiwan in ways that don't give our partners a lot of confidence that they should stick their head above the parapet. We've got to be brave and strong in doing that ourselves.
So Vina and André?
Yeah, I'll be quick. So to Margaret's point about Beijing's objectives in terms of the psychological warfare that I mentioned earlier, when your adversaries engage in psychological warfare, the first thing you have to do is practice psychological poise, which essentially means exactly what President Tsai Ing-wen said in her National Day address earlier in October. You have to be calm, confident, and you have to engage in consistent action that is based on your own strategy rather than just constantly reacting. And it's really difficult to do that if you are not psychological poise is one of the hardest things to do when you live in a moment of crisis. And right now we have polycrises, and most of us are unable to function from that place of calm confidence that understands what we need to do and that we have to invest and we have to prepare, but we cannot panic and we cannot be driven by fear and react to things without strategically thinking what the next step will be. On the issue of how do we engage with Southeast Asian countries that are a bit nervous about alienating China, we have to recognize that some of it is a problem that we have created, and by we I mean the West, by making China the main game in town. We don't offer enough economic opportunities. I mean, the U.S. is still reluctant to engage in serious free trade agreements and other market access for the countries there. So I think we have to recognize that this is partly a problem of our own creation, and it will take some time to rectify. I think that's being now recognized, that out of all of the components of our strategy in the region, the economic piece was the last one to come online. It now is coming online, and also the gravitational pull of Chinese economy is also fading because China is now experiencing the difficulties that others spoke about it already. So I think kind of watch the space. I think that conversation will change, Margaret, in part for various reasons. We're bringing in more options. China is pulling back a little bit, and I think those conversations will deepen and it'll get a little bit easier. Finally, on the one China versus one China policy versus one China principle, you're absolutely right, Dr. Singh, and I think China's position, as you outlined it, is very coherent, very simple, and easily understandable. Our policies are a combination of various, in the U.S. case, legislative actions, Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 communications, 3 communiques, 6 assurances. Right, exactly. So it's a mouthful, and you have to spend a lot of time to understand. But I think the main point I would make on that is that we can, certainly in the case of Canada, we can interpret our one China policy much more creatively and much more ambitiously. We do not need to self-censor, either because we want to please Beijing or because we fear Beijing, right? There can be meaningful action already taken in deepening relations with Taiwan. We don't need to have more acts through our parliament, because everything that MP Cooper outlined, with the exception of renaming the office, everything else can be done now. We can have more trade, we can have more economic engagement, we can have more visits. All of that can be done, and the reason it's not being done is because of our conservative interpretation of our position. We only took note of China's position with respect to Taiwan. We didn't even acknowledge it. We certainly haven't endorsed it. It's taking note. In the diplomatic language, that's fairly weak, as diplomats in the room know. So I'll stop there.
André?
The weakest, exactly.
Almost everything has been said, but I would agree with Margaret that the issue of person-to-person relation is very important for the improvement of relations between Taiwan and Southeast Asia. In particular, you mentioned, Ambassador, the situation of migrant workers. That is really a key issue that Taiwan will have to address. And for the issue of, the difference between the one China policy and the one China principle, totally agree with you, that it's something that we should learn to be agile at, differentiating very clearly.
So we'll take the 3 questions rapid fire, let the panel respond, and then we'll close off with Bijan there. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is John Packer. I'm Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, and I hold a professorship in International Conflict Resolution at the University of Ottawa. Great panel, already been said, and we need to have this more broadly heard. Kelley, thanks for coming. Sometimes we in Canada need our American cousins to come and tell us kind of straight to straight, eyeball, what we need to do. No, and I just will say in that the fudging around foundational norms like genocide, like self-determination, this is bedrock post-Second World War stuff. And, you know, our government absents itself to abstain on a vote in Parliament, you know, on a pretty critical issue on this. And similarly, we don't want to talk about self-determination. It's Article 1 of the UN Charter. It's Article 1 of the 2 covenants of the United Nations and so forth. So I'll come back to this in just a second. What I want to say is, yes, Vina, you're right, that in terms of diplomacy, how we present this and how we competently understand it. Because neither Article 1 nor and certainly not of the 2 covenants mentions independence or sovereignty. It says that there's a right of peoples to determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. That's totally possible in any kind of permutation. So we have all in islands with more economic independence in Europe than most European states. Most people don't know that, but they do. We have in Canada, we have 3 seats at the Francophonie. How did that happen? How was it that we had 2 premiers ministres qui sont accueillis le chef d'État à la ville de Québec? Because that's how it functions. So it's totally possible to reconcile this matter if we understand it. But what we can't do is avoid dealing with the problem, because these are root core problems. Okay, quick advertisement. Last week in Brussels, there was announced at the EU a new document NGO produced on mediating self-determination. So I draw everyone's attention to that. Here's my question. How can we pursue this, to take up Kelley's point? You know, Canada's position in the world. If we are reliable, if we are serious, then we actually can pursue this. But we have to pursue it with competence and conviction. What's your suggestion to how we can play this role? Because my view is it's desperately needed, this kind of reconciling role. Do you have any ideas of structurally how to pursue this?
Next, please, Samuel.
Okay, hi, I'm Sam. I'm just a student at Ottawa, Sam Villanov. I have questions that might be too big for the times we have left, so I'll try still and I'll be fast. The topic of the coming elections wasn't mentioned much, but I have the coming elections in Taiwan. But I have a very Canadian question about them. What about Chinese interference? Is it a big topic, especially since, as far as I know, all candidates are Benchangren. They're all from Taiwanese families' background. Is that relevant? Does that mean the Chinese state trusts them less? Is that still a relevant dichotomy in Taiwanese politics? And my second question is a lot more abstract. The Indo-Pacific framework, the mental map we've adopted, it comes from Abe Shinzo. It's a very Japanese concept. But it's very broad. It doesn't mean much. It goes from Chile to Kenya, in theory. Did we adopt it too fast? And we talked about Canada having little resources for helping everything. Is that too broad? Is that in Canada's and Taiwan's interest, this mental map of the Indo-Pacific, so large as it is? So, yeah.
And then the last question.
Okay, quick final question. Hugh Stevens, Asia Pacific Foundation for Ambassador Currie. We talked about Taiwanese international representation. I was just wondering, I don't know enough about the UN system. Are there models of quasi-state or non-state entities? And I'm thinking of the Palestinian Authority or the Aga Khan Foundation or something like that, that with some creativity could be adapted to give Taiwan a voice and some space in these agencies. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, I think of the example of Ukraine and Belarus before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They had the Soviet Union had 3 seats.
The Vatican, the Palestinian Authority. There are actually a number of different arrangements, and you could even start to argue, and I mean, this would go really deep in the weeds. There's something called the Trusteeship Council in the United Nations, and a whole 4th committee that dealt with decolonization issues that is still in existence and still dealing. Well, but yeah, we got rid of the trusteeship council, but it never actually formally went away. But the whole fourth committee still deals with issues of decolonization that are unresolved. And the United States, I think Canada also has to go into this, into the fourth committee and deal with decolonization issues. And we're constantly having to go in and deal with decolonization issues of the United States. But nobody thinks much about fourth committee. But, you know, you could argue in Taiwan's case, if you really want to get crazy, that Taiwan is a case of unfinished decolonization because it should have been decolonized after World War II, but wasn't because of the intercession of the Chinese Civil War. And that bigfooted the whole issue of decolonization of Taiwan. And, you know, I have a whole theory there, but the Taiwanese don't love me talking about it. But on the other questions, I think that, yes, I think that, again, Canada we've got to play to our strengths. I think that, you know, in addition to niceness, Canada's strength is that as an open democracy that is very plural and has had to struggle with a lot of challenges of internal colonization and decolonization and federalism and all of these things that you mentioned about this very adaptive federal structure, that is a strength that, you know, saying that there is more than one way for a country to organize itself, and the Chinese Communist Party's model of how to organize the country is not the only way, and that there are ways to talk about this, and that, you know, you can do that in a very Canadian, you know, I'm sorry, but what about kind of way that is actually quite effective, more effective than the way that the United States often does things. And I think on the election interference, I guess I can let Russ should take that one, but yes, it's happening a lot, and but the Taiwanese are doing a really good job of pushing back on it, especially in cyber.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the interference question. So yes, this is a persistent threat to Taiwan's democracy. The CCP is engaged in a very comprehensive influence campaign to influence Taiwan's elections, and this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time. But this is through United Front activities by front organizations directly subordinate to the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party, essentially utilizing front civil society groups, association and exchanges, online and in person, to be able to funnel, in some cases, illegal, fundings for elections and local elections. This includes information operations through the co-optation of local medias, online, especially in the online environment is rampant, but it also includes traditional media outlets as well. Now, there's been, I think, a particular case in this election cycle that there are cases of information operations from the CCPs that is promoting an American skepticism theory within the discourse and within Taiwan, causing some concerns within the public with regards to questioning of U.S. commitments to Taiwan and its intentions, and aimed at really exacerbating social political tensions within Taiwan during this very, as always the case in Taiwan's democracy, a very contentious and a very competitive electoral environment. But this is one particular theme that has really cropped up, and just as a point of self-organizational promotion, a colleague of mine, John Dawson, authored a report that focuses precisely on this campaign of Chinese information operations promoting this American skepticism theory within Taiwan's political discourse, and I have no doubt that similar activities are probably happening in Canada as well.
In the interest of time, I'll only make one comment, and that's on the elections as well. And just to reinforce the point that, yes, China is engaged in a very aggressive campaign of interference, but what's interesting is that Taiwan has developed whole of society approach to defend against that, and this is an area where Canada and others can learn from Taiwan in the spirit of seeing Taiwan as a genuine partner. I think we can come in and learn how to put in place the same kind of government institutions as well as civil society institutions, and how to address this ongoing challenge. So it's, again, on the theme of Taiwan as a genuine partner and things that we can be learning in engaging with the Taiwanese community, society.
on the question of whether the Indo-Pacific idea is too broad. I'm very nervous because I am surrounded by people who were involved in the shaping of that strategy. But on the receiving end, I think it did a good job in conveying the message that our foreign policy with respect to Asia should not be limited to one country. And I think it was successful in that sense. So, of course, it's large, it's ambiguous, but that's, I think, a merit of that approach. So that leaves us lots of flexibility.
And with that, please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. And to close us off for the day, welcome Bijan to the stage.
Thank you, Darren. I'll be quick in closing. It has been a long day, but looking at the number of attendees, all of you staying for the full day, for the program, for the full day program, I think I can confidently say that our speakers, our moderators, our panelists have done a fantastic job. So please join me in a round of applause for all our speakers and moderators. I also would like to once again thank Russell and his team at Global Taiwan Institute for joining us as a co-sponsor for this event. Please check their website. They're a great resource on research and analysis on Taiwan. Also, I would like to thank Taiwan's representative office here in Canada, Dr. Harry Sang and his team for their support for this initiative, for this event as well. In the coming weeks, we're going to publish a report compiling the key takeaways and the recommendations that the speakers shared with us today. So please check our website, peacediplomacy.org, and that report will be published soon as well. I hope to see you all again soon in our upcoming events. Our third annual Indo-Pacific Strategy Forum will be on December 4th and December 5th. We'll do that conference together with Canada West Foundation. So please check our website in the beginning of November to find out more about the Indo-Pacific Strategy Forum as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Goodbye.